All right, peace and love, everybody. This is brother Garfield, and before I bring on the guest and my panelists, brother 93, I'm gonna first and foremost tell you the gentleman that's coming on. His name is Razib Khan. He's a geneticist. I don't have his whole bio here, but this gentleman, I was introduced to him through a YouTube video on a channel called Studies of the Antiquities, and today we're basically talking about genetics and as far as population genetics, as far as where we are right now currently in the Americas, in the West African, Central African area, the what we call the ancient Near East or modern day Middle East, so-called Middle East, and we have also we talk about the Levant, which includes Sumer and those regions, Mesopotamia and so forth. All right. So first and foremost, let me just introduce Razib Khan. Peace and love, my brother. How are you today?
Good so far.
So far, so good, huh? All right. Also, my panelist, of course, my brother from the Dagger Squad, 93. How you doing, Fortune?
Peace. I'm good.
All right. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen who are listening, this is not going to be a lengthy interview. I'm just going to have Mr. Khan on probably 35 to 45 minutes, and he's going to do his best to answer the questions and introduce us to genetics. I'm a dummy when it comes to genetics, so if my questions seem kind of weird or rookie-ish, for lack of a better term, please bear with me. All right. Um, First and foremost, what's your background in genetics?
Yeah. So I've been involved in various ways for 20 years. So I'm a writer. I've had a blog. I've also written for various publications. People can find that at razib.com. I have a Substack, razib.substack.com. Like a lot of the genetic content is there right now. I also do consulting, and I've worked for personal genomics companies. So, for example, National Geographic had an ancestry thing. I basically did their last edition of the Genographic. I worked on family tree origins, my origins. I worked at a couple of startups relating to personal genetics. One of them was actually related to dogs, Embark Veterinary. I was one of their first employees there. In graduate school, I worked in mammalian evolutionary genomics. I was super interested in domestication. I've been an enthusiast for personal genomics for a long time. You can find all my if you Google Razib Khan genotype, you can get all of my genome for free. If you want to look at it, I had my son sequenced before he was born in 2014. Excuse me. And so I'm interested in the past. I'm interested in the future in terms of what genetics can do with health. I consult for various companies. For my quote day job, and then I do all this writing, this communication because I'm really passionate about it.
Right. You mentioned something that was important to me that I participated in, which was Spencer Wells was like the face of the National
Yep.
Geographic. He wanted to get like 1 million people
Yep.
worldwide, and so that he could map the whole genome for the entire Earth. What's going on with that project? Because I didn't download my results, so they're like gone
Sure.
forever.
I can
Or
actually tell
how
you.
will
I
I
can tell
ever
you.
get it back? Okay,
So Spencer was my boss for 2 years.
right.
Okay. At a company called Insightome. I also worked with him when he was at National Geographic before. And so I know him really well, friends. And So what happened is National Geographic was purchased by Fox Corporation. They got the genetic stuff like that because they National Geographic was split into a nonprofit that did like the grants and all of that stuff, and then a for-profit like the channel. I
Right.
believe the genetic stuff was actually put to the for-profit, and it was quite profitable for a long time. But to be entirely frank, they didn't invest many resources over the last decade or so. They were early pioneers. They really blew up, and then they kind of just collected off that. They did collect millions. I mean, I think they did get 1 million people, but the problem is they didn't allocate resources to do as much analysis as they Spencer wanted to do. One reason he left, but they did do collaborations, papers with other people. There have been interesting results that have come out of that. There'll probably be more interesting results over the many years to come out of it. But they stopped collecting. They kind of shut down the website, as you know. They excuse me. They stopped supporting it. So that's where that is, and that's why you should download your DNA, man. Same.
Oh man, so that is that gone forever? Will I ever see that again, or would I ever have the chance
I
to
don't.
get that?
I think they deleted it, man. I think because they just didn't want to support it anymore. They didn't want to like. So the issue is like they could push into marketing to sell those kits, but that would mean that they would have to like open a new line, and Fox didn't want to do that, and so Fox was okay with collecting the cash, and then at a certain point, the cash went below their expenses, and so they're like, we're going to delete. It's a for profit, right?
Hmm.
And so that's how they run it. Like if it's losing money, it's losing money. You're gone. So they deleted all the data from what I know, and all of that staff. That's like by the end, there was only one guy that was totally dedicated to genographic, and he was let go. I think so. That is that. That's the past. It was the beginning. Arguably, the genographic project in the mid 2000s was a big deal, and Spencer's boss. They had a bet of how many they would sell within like the first like month, and Spencer made an optimistic bet. The boss made a pessimistic bet, and within the first day, they broke the 1 month barrier that they were expecting. So it was really successful at first because it was groundbreaking, but they didn't invest in it, and it kind of just slowly faded out as 23andMe, Ancestry, these other companies invested in it, and so they grew, gained traction, and that's capitalism, right?
Right. All right, so let's get to one of the first questions. Can a single human father have a specific paternal haplogroup, such as A0, and produce three sons with one generation with three drastically different Y DNA, such as DE, CF, and A1? And would their sons within one generation have radically different paternal haplogroups?
Yeah. So this is kind of like this is a weird thing because can is different than will. And so,
Hmm.
like, let's say that the universe existed for trillions and trillions of years. There are things that can happen within trillions of years that are not going to happen in billions of years, right? Excuse me. So basically, no is the simple answer. Yes is the theoretical answer, and that's because of how we define what a haplogroup is. What is a haplogroup? The way that you define what a haplogroup is from the perspective of a geneticist is you look at the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial DNA. You could also do haplogroups are not generally done as much for the autosomal for the whole genome, but they can be done there. But it's basically a segment of DNA that's inherited from a common ancestor. Okay, that's what it is theoretically. So I have haplogroup R1AZ93. That means 5,000 years ago there was a guy in Belarus who had a mutation at Z93 within the R1A haplogroup, and his descendants include me. Okay, so that's the reality. But what we geneticists do is use the mutations to infer that. Now, that's not 100% truth. That's 99.99999% truth, right? And so,
Right.
in theory, you could have like hundreds of mutations create this weird result. It could happen, right? You could actually do genetic engineering and create this if you wanted to. Now, does this ever happen? No, because the probability is so low. So, across the whole genome, the mutation rate at a given base pair per generation is 10 to the negative 8. It's really low. So, most of the time, you have when you have like genes being copied from parent to offspring, there's no mutations, like it's a perfect copy, right? So A naught gives rise to A naught, uh, you know, DE gives rise to DE, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens over time is a large enough population, mutations build up, and you can trace the mutations, and tracing the mutations is how you trace the genealogy. And so when you say that someone is A naught or A1 or A2, like all of these things, those are defining the mutations and the diversification. And in terms of the letters are the biggest haplogroup categories, right? And your listeners
Hmm.
probably know that. So if you're haplogroup A, obviously you go way back into the past. If you're haplogroup A naught, you go back
Not so far
usually,
back.
yeah, you go back not as far back. So A naught, A1, A2, all of those. And so a lot of the naming, there's a new naming system that's much more rational, but it's really hard to understand, to be honest. Rational, I mean like there's a system of how it's done. It was originally not like, for example, the Y chromosome. I can tell you because Spencer, my boss, who you referred to, was there at the beginning of the '90s. Why are why are the haplogroups named the way they're named? Well, a lot of it just has to do with the original researcher. He assigned like Native Americans this letter. He assigned Asians this letter. Blah blah blah, like that. Like there was no like rhyme or
Right,
reason,
right. Hmm.
right? But once it's set that way, then you have to follow it. So all of these labels, what they're really defining is population history, gene history, and there's an imperfection in them. Like you miss something there, and so far as like we're cutting things and dividing things in particular ways. But the answer to the question that you just asked me is no, really, that can't happen because the differences between two haplogroups are defined by a bunch of mutations, and you would have to have a bunch of mutations from father to son or mother to daughter for mitochondria for that to happen, right? And so, how do we assign your haplogroup when we get the raw data? It's not like we have a time machine and we see who your common ancestor is. What we do is count the number of mutations, and then we do the best alignment fit, right? And so people are going to differ just a little bit, but you can see these haplogroups emerging from like radiations from common ancestors, and that's how we assign people. Does that make sense?
Yes,
I got a
definitely.
question real quick. So some people say that can happen. They posit or speculate stuff like rapid radiation makes that happen. But how common like is that? Like is that like something that really happens often?
Yeah, so for males in particular, rapid radiation is actually common. They're called star phylogenies. I don't know what you guys' haplogroups are, but I'm part of a star phylogeny myself. Rapid radiation about 4,000 years ago. That doesn't increase the mutation rate, but what it does is it induces a bottleneck, and it's so basically when you create genealogies, we can label them with numbers and letters wherever we want to, but what scientists are trying to do is capture the population history. And so when you see a split off and a rapid bottleneck, okay, that's a haplogroup right there, right? Because what you want to do is like tell people what the history is, what the underlying demographics are, and give them a sense of that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I'm not going to try to say it's a total art, but in the beginning, in particular, they didn't have that much data, they didn't have that much results, so they could just look at it and just kind of assign it. Now we have like tens of millions, hundreds of millions of haplogroups, in the world. And so we have this original scaffold of classification, and people are fitting it into it. And when you see like the new updated labels and these personal genomic companies like ISOG, they have it. It's because we have like so many different branches, and how you assign the branches. They wanted to make it more systematic, right? So like my haplogroup is like, I think in theory it's like R1A, 1A, blah 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 blah. Like why is it so long? Because it's defining all of the mutational steps.
Okay. This question is number two. Are there any genetic papers positing a mass migration of the E1B1A out of the Levant in Western Asia and into West Africa? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is E1B1A indigenous to Western Asia?
Yeah. I saw this, like I've seen some of these. These are actually like pretty deep questions in terms of like, I think they will be answered. So there's one issue is tropical areas in general. We have not that much ancient DNA. And then also there's some political reasons. So for example, there's not that much ancient DNA out of Iraq. That's not because it's not dry and it's good. You know what I'm saying? There's not that much ancient DNA out of Iraq because like we messed up Iraq. And like researchers don't want to go into Iraq and get kidnapped or something, right? So there's like political issues going on there. In Africa, like in a lot of tropical Asia, when it's wet and it's humid, DNA degrades, so it kind of gets harder. David Reich's lab, I know they have some stuff that's coming out, delayed by COVID. They've gotten stuff out of caves in Cameroon here and there, but we have a lot of data in Europe because it's cold and some parts of it were dry, especially the north during the Ice Age. We have not that much data out of West Asia, but we got some, and we have very little out of Africa, tropical Asia, right? And so some of these questions that you're asking, I can't give a really good answer because we don't have enough of the data. What I will say is there are connections between Africa and West Africa and Eurasia, Southwest Eurasia in particular, the Mediterranean, West Asia, that people are just exploring. So initially, people used to think, well, Africa is the homeland of modern humans, and you use them as an outgroup, and you look at Neanderthal admixture and blah, 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 using Africans as zero, right? Well, it turns out the Yoruba, who are the original African population that geneticists often use from the HapMap and the 1,000 Genomes, have a little bit of Neanderthal ancestry. Where'd that come from? I mean, almost certainly that's due to what we call Eurasian back migration. We call it back migration because the original pulse was out of Africa. But some Eurasians, almost certainly from West Eurasia, because you can tell that Africans look a little bit more like West Eurasians than they do like say Chinese. Okay, so
Right.
they didn't come all the way from China. They came from where you would expect, probably the Middle East. They went into Africa. Like, when did they go into Africa? Some of it we know is relatively recent. So R1b V88, that's in Chad.
In
Spencer
Cameroon, right.
working on
Hmm.
that paper. That's clearly a Holocene. So it's within the last 12,000 years. It's probably with, like, pastoralists or something like that. And there's low levels of so the Y chromosome is high frequency, so the paternal lineage is preserved. But overall, they're pretty African. But now they have been able to detect appreciable levels of Eurasian ancestry, and that ancestry is higher in the groups that have more R1b. Okay, so we know that there was recent back migration. We know that for sure. But a lot of researchers think that there was connections and back migrations pretty deep in the Pleistocene, pretty deep in the Ice Age, say like 15, 20, 30,000 years ago, right? And so when you're asking about questions about E1, like haplogroup E in particular, I'm very, very fuzzy and non-committal. There are E's that are found in the Natufians 10,000 years ago, right? So we know that it was in the Near East a long time ago. But we don't have enough data from Africa to say that, so here's a scenario, and this is not necessarily the scenario I believe, but it's a plausible scenario. You could have E1, the ancestor, say in the southern Sahara. It goes north at the end of the Ice Age, and then it diversifies with the agriculturalists, and then it comes back with some agriculturalists. So, like, how do I answer the question in that case, right? Because, like, we are positing from Spencer's original work, like, geneticists used to think that, oh, you have the stepwise migration out of Africa and you never looked back, but that's not true at all. Like, there's a lot of back migration in Africa. There's a few populations that have been only minimally impacted by West Eurasian ancestry, but that's really low in terms of the number. So the Bambuti pygmies, like Eastern pygmies in the Congo, and then maybe the Hadza. But even like Khoisan, Bushman people in South Africa, they have Cushitic ancestry, and that Cushitic ancestry has West Asian ancestry within it, right? So it's hard to separate these different groups. And so, like, I mean, you're asking about, like, in the questions, like, you're asking about these haplogroups that are found today in certain areas. And with some of them, I can like give you a good answer, mostly because ancient DNA is pretty clear and they're recent. But E1b, it seems pretty ancient in West Asia, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not ancient in Africa because we don't have the data. And it's at such a high frequency in Africa, as you guys know. Like African hunter-gatherers have the other haplogroups, right? But African agriculturalists tend to be E. It could be a matter of what happened in Chad, where R1b, where there was like a small group of males whose lineages were really high status and they got diluted over time. And we've seen this in other areas. Recent paper out of Orkneys in Northern Europe, which shows Neolithic Y chromosomes, even though the rest of the genome was totally erased, with women coming in every generation from the continent, right? So you can imagine that's one scenario that you can posit, or you can imagine that the whole trans-Saharan zone was a contact zone, and that contact zone gave rise to multiple E branches. That's also plausible. I don't have a strong opinion about where the Semitic languages and stuff come from, or Afroasiatic, because I've talked to people and nobody knows for sure at this point. It's very unclear. So that's an unanswerable question, but that's the truth, I think, at this point.
All right, cool. So, but for sure, for the second part of the question, is E1B1A indigenous to Western Asia?
It was there. It was there at the end of the last Ice Age.
Okay.
Because we have
one thing I gotta ask you while in your response. You said around the Natufian time period, which is around what, 12,000 years ago, around that time
it's
period?
like right at the beginning of agriculture.
How does a geneticist or a scientist go about dating the DNA? What's the process of that?
So
In your shortest answer ever, because I know it's a very complicated.
Dating the DNA is usually they have artifacts that, like, if someone's buried, they're buried with artifacts, so they have like good dates already. So you can date it with artifacts with radiocarbon. You could do a dendrochronology if there's tree rings around. There's other primitive techniques. Also, one thing with the DNA is a lot of times they're not actually modern haplogroups. You can actually tell that they're basal to the modern haplogroups, and you can define them on the phylogenetic tree and use a mutation rate. That's actually not the best in my opinion, but it gives a rough sense, and it usually correlates well with the radiocarbon.
Okay, so the mutation rate is not 100%, but it's near to what? you would normally come up with outside of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Question number, what is this? Question number 3. Hold on 1 second here. Um, Here we go. Let me see if I have it right here. Okay, there are groups that make claims for E1B1A being a founding haplogroup among Semitic groups. Is E1B1A found in high frequencies among Semitic populations like J1? Would the ancient Arabians and Syrians and Israelites have had high percentages of E1B1A within their populations in antiquity?
Yeah, they did, but they also had J1. So this is my opinion. So take that for what it is. I think that J1 and J2 probably were not, and I'm going to say Afroasiatic because, like the Egyptians spoke a non-Semitic language, but it was Afroasiatic, like more closely related to that of the Amazigh people, the Berbers, right? So North Africa had a different branch before the Semitic, whatever. So I'll say Afroasiatic, Semitic, and whatever the other groups like Tuareg and stuff. So it looks like the Natufians had it. It looks like there was a massive admixture between Western and Eastern Levant, Middle Eastern people, probably before 3000 BC, but after, let's say after like 8000 BC, somewhere like in prehistory, there was a genetic exchange, and the J's, J1, J2, seem to show up during that exchange in the Levant and the western part of the Middle East. I don't think Afroasiatic languages are from Western Iran, which is where they would come from. Therefore, I don't think. Also, like you find J2 and J's in Europe and in India, and obviously, and that's not due to Semitic migration, right? So they're ancient lineages that are in like the Indus Valley civilization, and what. Excuse me. So I think E is probably more likely to be Afroasiatic, and they had high frequencies in Arabians, Syrians, and Israelites.
Okay. All right.
Wait, you mean E1B1A or E1B1B when you say that?
You know, I don't know all of those off the top of my head. Also, when you go back far enough, you're not going to get those divisions because it's you're going up the tree, so it will converge, right? So it would be E1B1 star at some point, and I don't know when that is. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay. So you don't know the exact mutations. You don't know.
Yeah, because some of the mutations are recent. So you'll see stars sometimes.
Okay. All right. Does the 93 you finish, or you wanted to add on?
No, you can go ask the next question.
All right. Does the phylogenetic tree posit a 6,000-year-old Earth or something much older? Is it scientifically possible to accept the phylogenetic tree but reject human evolution?
I don't think so, but there are people who are creationists who do use phylogenetics. So basically, what you'd have to say is like the mutation rate or something, some parameter is way different, and everything is foreshortened. But so you could believe in the topology of the tree, but think that the scaling is totally off. But I mean, I'm skeptical of that, obviously. But you can believe in the tree and the relatedness, but think the scaling is different.
Okay. All right. Are there any grounds for a non-expert in genetics to reject haplogroup CT and BT due to their belief that neither haplogroup has a living descendant?
Yeah, I mean, so some of these haplogroups are basically like I mean, I don't even know what does it mean reject? Like they're constructs. They have to have existed. Sometimes you'll find ancient individuals. So, for example, Malta boy from Siberia is R star. You can't define it as R1 or R2, but it like dates to 30,000 years ago, or 35,000 years ago, whatever, right? It's really old. At some point we are going to find, CT, BT, we're going to find like really, really ancient haplogroups. And so we'll construct them. But right now they're inferences, right? And mutation happens. Things evolve and change. And that's just how it is.
Okay. All right. All right. According to genetic research, what would have been the dominant haplogroups of West Africa and West Asia during the Bronze Age and Iron Age? And also, what would have been the most prevalent haplogroup in both regions during around the first century AD?
Yeah, I think So the Bronze Age would be. It depends on where you're talking about. I don't think they're going to be that different than today. We have samples from the Bronze Age and earlier. Like I said, J1 and J2 show, and to a lesser extent, like R1A and other weird ones, lower frequencies, start showing up in the Bronze Age and Iron Age and West Asia. But in general, it's like 80% similar to the modern, just like 60 to 80% similar to the modern distribution. Put it that way. I think West Africa probably the same. I am of the school that I think that there's probably a deep connection between most West Africans and Eurasians dating to the Pleistocene. So probably the Y chromosomal haplogroups. I think that they're associated with a group called basal Eurasians that don't have that much Neanderthal. Okay. I think that there's something that we're missing in the models connecting Africans to non-Africans. And I think it's old, and I think ancient DNA will resolve it. So I think the haplogroup distribution by the Bronze Age was probably not that dissimilar. The main issue is the expansion of farmer populations happened in the Iron Age. So, haplogroups like associated with A and whatnot, and B were way more common probably in the Bronze Age. But within West Africa, Nigeria, Cameroon area, probably the E's were already there, in my opinion.
All right. All right. Given the available evidence we have, would you say Semitic Levantine populations in antiquity were homogeneous or diverse in their genetic makeup?
They were diverse. Yeah, I think
Okay.
that's the easiest way to say it.
All right, cool. Let me get to the next question. Let me put this on the screen. How did ancient Semitic and East African groups survive off consuming so much dairy, given the prevalence of lactose intolerance currently found in both populations?
So there's a lot of fermentation, like cheeses and other things that consume the lactose. So that's one thing. You can reduce the amount of lactose in the dairy. And the second thing is your microbacterial guts. They're also conditioned to lactose. And so there can be cultural adaptations that are not genetic. We're not very clear about like what the genetic driver of lactose tolerance at this point is actually. We know what it is genetically, but in terms of adaptation, it seems to have actually kicked off relatively late in Europe, well after dairying. And so it's not like super as clear as it was 10 years ago because we have more data now.
Okay.
So I think the same applies to Africa and West Asia.
All right, beautiful. All right, given what we know about DNA, would the oldest populations that carried haplogroup DE have differed phenotypically from its descendants?
Well, I mean, this depends on the time scale. If you give enough time, yes, but obviously not within like 100 years. I don't know. I mean, the question is basically like I need a time scale.
Right. Okay. All right. Let me go to the next question. What was the genetic diversity of ancient Egypt like, given the available evidence? Would the ancient Egyptians have been diverse in their genetic spectrum or homogeneous?
Yeah, compared to the modern Egyptians, they were they were less diverse, but I mean they're still like diverse. They weren't like super homogeneous. So basically there's not that much evidence, but there is a little bit. And the little bit of evidence that we have, along with the distribution of the modern DNA, is that most of the sub-Saharan African ancestry in modern Egyptians dates to the Islamic period and later, because of the increase in trade. Some of it does date to an older period, and it looks like it increased over time. So the Old Kingdom Egyptians would have had the least sub-Saharan African ancestry and increased into the New Kingdom, into the Roman period, and then really jumped during the Islamic period. Also, Middle Eastern type DNA, that's like from the Levant and Arabia and stuff like that. That's increased somewhat, obviously, since the Islamic period in particular. But last I checked, majority of the ancestry of modern Egyptians still goes back to say like Old Kingdom type people. It's just they've added more sub-Saharan African ancestry, they've added more West Asian ancestry. The Mamelukes that ruled Egypt, they were mostly from the Caucasus or Turks. And so like in modern Egyptian Muslims, you see a little bit of East Asian ancestry that's almost always from the Turks.
Okay. All right. I want to put a question on the screen, but I don't know how I'm going to share this. Let me see if I could. Let me see if I could share this. All right, you know what? Let me read the question. Maybe this would be easier to actually read it out. All right, the question is when a haplogroup. Oh, I can't share it. Hold on one second. Let me just share the screen. Facebook. All right. All right. I don't know if you can see the screen, but when a haplogroup comes into existence, okay, it's actually sharing. I want to make it bigger. Let me bring my brother. I just added Amir, brother Ngozi on also. He's a biology major. When a haplogroup comes into existence, is it possible for that haplogroup to reappear in another line at a later point? For example, a scenario in which thousands of years after EV38 and EM215 already came into existence, a man with EP2 produces descendants who have EV8 and EM215, who themselves do not descend from previously existing carriers of those subclades.
Yeah. So in genetics, there's a term called identity by descent, and there's another term called identity by state. So identity by descent is pretty straightforward. It's almost like a metaphysical, like, do you descend from this person? Was this gene copied from this ancestral person? Identity by state is just like what the sequence of the DNA is. And so obviously with mutation, you can have things like back mutation, where it reverts back to a previous state. And so, yes, in theory, you could revert back to another haplogroup. But what that's going to happen is it just means that the geneticists are going to get confused about the descent, right? Because what we're trying to do with haplogroups and stuff like that is figure out identity by descent from identity by state. Sometimes identity by state misleads you. And so what I would say is like that's actually misleading you in terms of what you're asking about, because with haplogroups, you don't care about the DNA just for the DNA's sake. You actually care about what it tells you about the descent. Does that make sense?
Yes. For clarity's sake, there was a question I asked earlier regarding if E1B1A is indigenous to West Asia, and you had replied that the Natufians was carrying some sort of E1B1 mixture, admixture, presumably because we talked about E1B1A. You responded with a E1B1 response. So can you clarify if E1B1A is indigenous to West Asia?
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to look up because like some of these are not. Yeah, so Natufian. You said E1B1A because the Natufians are like 12,000 years old. I don't know. Yeah, so the Natufians are E1B1, which means that it might be a descendant of that. So E1B1 is Natufian, E1A is PPN. Yeah, I'm not like sure if I can give a clear answer because I think the age is going to be is too deep to ask that. In terms of like some of these haplogroups built up their mutations more recently than 12,000 years ago. Does that answer the question?
Right.
That's why I was kind of vague there.
Yeah, because those specimens, I believe it's like 5 of them. There was a E1B1, and then 2 of them was E1B1B. And as a matter of fact, this is my cousin, my friend. He studies genetics. His name is Amir, and we invited him on. He talks about the Natufians too.
So hey, how you doing, Dr. Razib? I'm a fan of you, and I'm a fan of Dr. Spencer Wells. I mean, I've been following a lot of things that you do for years. I wanted to ask you, there's a lot of misinformation about ancient Egypt, and you talked about the late Pleistocene connection with some of the basal Eurasians, possibly this haplogroup E that developed possibly based on postulation somewhere probably in Arabia, estimation probably 70,000 years ago, what they're labeling as basal Eurasians. But what I wanted to ask you is about the layers of the ancient Egyptians, which we do know that a large population of Near Eastern people back migrated into Egypt as early as probably or North Africa as early as 40,000 years ago or 30,000 years ago. But I wanted to ask you about the early Assyrian population, which represents the Middle Stone Age North Africans, that was possibly responsible for the human exit out. Those layers that possibly also went through south of the Sahara and mixed up with other groups, because people kind of don't understand the diversity of Africa. how even if we did have basal Eurasians that back migrated in, they literally come from those North Africans that leaked out, and were they far off in distinction biologically? Because like with this E thing, it's a lot of confusion going on, and some people are saying because haplogroup E developed in outside of Africa and came back in, this is a banner to say that some people can say that they're a Hebrew, a Egyptian, and different things, not understanding that these markers predate these cultures and ethnicities. So I wanted to ask you about that, sir.
Yep. So you're going into like an area that, in my opinion, like we actually don't know that much. So I do understand that a lot of people say basal Eurasians came from West Asia. We don't actually know for sure. And like, you know, I know personally the guy that invented, like, Yosef Lazaridis came up with basal Eurasians. I've asked him to his face. He's very unclear where they were. They could be in North Africa. You know, they could be somewhere in the Sahara. They could be in East Africa. That's still within the realm of possibility. So that's why I'm being really vague about this, because we don't actually know for sure until we get the ancient DNA. We don't have any individual from that period that's mostly basal Eurasian. Like, maybe they never existed as a pure population. That's another thing that people have told me who have worked in this area. So you mentioned the Assyrians. Assyrians are, you know, mostly the modern Maghreb, you know, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. You know, we have Jebel Irhoud in Morocco that dates to 300,000 years ago or so. That's like on the way to modernity. So within Africa, it looks like proto-modern humans were evolving and developing into what we are today in multiple different places in multiple different ways. And the out of Africa migration of modern humans from Africa kind of misled people into thinking that it was like, oh, this like one tribe that blew up. That only applies outside of Africa. Within Africa, multiple modern human groups were there for hundreds of thousands of years, well before the out of Africa migration, right? In terms of this back migration idea, if you think of Africa just as a geographic continent, not sub-Saharan Africa, I wouldn't be shocked if like this back migration actually happened from Northern Africa, where there was no Neanderthal admixture. Excuse me, but that's where the basal Eurasians were, right? So, I mean, that's a weird answer, but I think one thing that we need to be open to is the idea the basal Eurasians are in the northern half of Africa somewhere, and maybe they expanded into the Middle East relatively later. And they never got Neanderthal admixture, right? And so they're a deep clade within the non-Africans, even if they're in Africa, that didn't have Neanderthal admixture, and they're confusing our perception of, you know, of like the population structure. So one idea that some people posited is, you know, within Africa, and this is true, like there's like this deep structure, and some of the African groups, so for example, like Nigerians, are phylogenetically placed between non-Africans and pygmies and Khoisan. Like, well, why is that? You know, I mean, one model is this back Eurasian back migration, but we don't even need to posit Eurasian necessarily if within Africa there was the Proto-Eurasian group as an African population. And then eventually we know that there was, during the Holocene, the last 12,000 years, Amir, the migration that I think you're talking about. Yes, they are. They're a branch of East Eurasians. Melanesians are. But so it could be a situation where the original basal Eurasian group in North Africa was mostly overlain by a Eurasian back migration, but they themselves are responsible for the Eurasian-like signal in most Africans that doesn't have much Neanderthal ancestry at all. Does that make sense? I mean, I know that's like a mouthful.
Amazing. And one more question, Doc. That's amazing. You answered it beautifully. And one more question. So would it be safe to say, if we can postulate just for a second, that haplogroup or mutation E, EM96, possibly developed in North Africa?
Yeah. I think so. That's why I'm like being really vague. I think we artificially divide North Africa. Like, you guys know from biogeography that Arabia and, you know, the southern part of West Asia is part of Africa. You know, so I think that we artificially are dividing this in our nomenclature.
So one more question, Doc. So when people say things like, because we're all human, there is no difference in race. We're human ultimately. You know, but my question is, when some people try to separate or delineate North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa, like the modern Egyptians or the Amazigh, those so-called Berbers. They're just as African as people south of the Sahara, regardless of the mutation. So when some people talk about ancient Egypt, and like you spoke of, modern Egyptians may be a little bit more diverse because of some signals come from the Arab slave trade, and some signals come from an old Saharic population that migrated in over there when these Natufian-like people were coming from the Levant corridor. But when we talk about these Egyptians in North Africa, would it be safe to say that these people are just as African, and we shouldn't denounce them from being African, regardless of the geographical location? We shouldn't say that they're not African or less African than people south, even though there's a distinction in time. Like for example, like the Yoruba, with the possible E1B1A, we know that sub-Saharan Africans have late downstream mutations of this mutation. They really come from like a Keithian group that was part of that same Saharic population that dispersed into the portions of North Africa. So even before we have this idea of a sub-Saharan African, or these people they develop their own clusters uniquely, there's a bridge with these people north in the early Sahara. So would it be safe to say that these Egyptians, even though they have small signals from Mongoloids or Turks or different things now, would it still be safe to say that these people are autochthonous Africans and we shouldn't separate them from being African?
So yeah, my short answer is yeah. I think the problem is we're applying modern terms to these ancient peoples who didn't know our classifications and didn't live in a world defined by our geopolitics. And so I think people get confused by the terminology. And so I think, we talk about Africans versus non-Africans just because of genetic distinction, because Africans are so diverse. But the way a lot of geneticists talk about it is non-Africans are just a branch of Africans. And that's because genetically they do nest within. And there's multiple different African groups. And some African groups are more like non-Africans, and some of them are not. So, for example, David Reich believes that the ancestral African group is actually, or non-African group, is closest to the Hadza, who are Tanzanian hunter-gatherers, right? So it's really difficult to use modern nomenclature to map to the past. But on the other hand, what are we going to do? We're not going to recreate new continent names. So I think we just have to be humble about it as we go forward. I think this African, non-African distinction in the context of paleogenetics, I'm a little wary of it at this point because it's confused so many people. So like I said, people talk about Eurasian back migration, but we're not really, I personally am not confident that Eurasian back migration was even from Eurasia. I mean, it could be, probably, maybe, but not like 90%, more like 55%, So I think we need to just be a little bit more humble and the clarity of the words we use is actually kind of an illusion. And, we all do come from these diversifying African populations 300,000 to 400,000 years ago, but it could be that a lot also happened in Arabia, which is biogeographically part of Africa. So to say it's not African is a little weird to me. Just in terms of the other organisms you see in Arabia, they're mostly like Northeast African organisms, right? So why wouldn't modern humans be part of it? Like we know now there are multiple, African type humans that seem to have gone into Europe and parts of the Middle East and then just died off. So there's this back and forth. It's just like a much more complex and subtle dynamic than what scientists have been presenting for the last 30 years. Scientists like simple narratives because it makes it easy. Unfortunately, our species history is not easy. It's complicated. And look, we're like talking over computers. Like we do cool things, so why would we expect that we would be like the simple phylogeny that a lot of other organisms are? We're not. Like we are
so true.
We're special.
They didn't have Google. They couldn't research you.
I
Quick question.
thank you, Doc. I thank you, Garfield. Thank you.
Yeah,
Salam.
That's all you had to ask, Ngozi?
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to what I was doing, but I'm listening. And Doc Razib, hey, I appreciate you, my brother. Thank you very much.
Take care, man.
Right. Are Melanesians genetically closer to modern East Asian than other groups?
Yeah, so I kind of answered this question. Basically, Melanesians. So within the eastern half of Eurasia, there is this deep split between, you could call it northern and southern East Eurasians. The northern East Eurasians are like Han Chinese and other groups, and they also moved south within the last 10,000 years, bringing agriculture into Southeast Asia. And the southern groups are like Australians, Papuans, people on the Andaman Islanders, Negritos. But all of these groups are part of the vast East Eurasian phylogenetic branch, basically, that diversified 40,000 years ago as they moved to the east of the Indus River Valley. Modern day Indians are a mix of west and east. So the indigenous Indians probably were more like the people in Southeast Asia. And then like people came from Iran and Central Asia. And, they brought West Eurasian like ancestry. And so people in the Indian subcontinent are a mix of the two. But once you go past the Indian subcontinent, it's overwhelmingly the Eastern branch, which includes Melanesians as well as East Asians.
Okay. There was a article in National Geographic that had this on the front page. Let me just share the screen. Hold on 1 second here. Let me share it. It's on National Geographic. It talks about DNA. Let me take this off the screen. It talks about the DNA from the Bible's Canaanites lives on in modern Arabs and
Sure.
Jews.
That's
A
true.
new study of ancient DNA traces the surprising heritage of these mysterious Bronze Age people. I think eventually the study's actually in the cell where you get more of
Yep.
the scientific feel to it. This was like a summary. But basically, they had up to, I think, up to 100 individuals that they actually checked. So can you go into that and explain? Because you said it like modern day 60 to 80%. You gave like an average for
Egyptians,
people
yeah.
from way past, right? Mhm.
I think for like the Levant, it's more like 80%. So my friend Mark Haber, he's at Manchester now, but I mean, he's worked on some of this. There's other people. Like basically, if you go back 10,000 years, people in places like Israel and Lebanon were pretty different. Like Natufians, like half Natufian maybe.
Mhm.
And then something happened before prehistory, but after, say, 6,000, 8,000 BC, where people from the east came in and mixed with the indigenous people, and they also moved the other way too. And so you get this like mixture of like West Asian people, and the haplogroups are EJ, usually, maybe a few L's here and there. I don't know. And so this is the original stock that you see in these Bronze Age cities in the Phoenicia. And also they found things from Ashkelon, I think, in Israel. And so this is the original stock of much of the Western Middle East, of the Levant. And it's been overlaid in some ways by later migrations. And I think the Caucasus is mentioned there. So later migrations, there's Indo-Europeans that came, there are Turks that came, et cetera, right? Later during the Islamic period, lots of African slaves came, and south of Turkey, there's a fair amount of that ancestry too. But the original founding stock, most of the ancestry does date to the Bronze Age, the empires of, the Jews, Egyptians,
Right. Mhm.
Hittites, all these.
Assyria, Persian.
That's
Mhm.
that was the period when it all came together. If you go back to the end of the Ice Age, it was all much more chunky. What happened is there was like a great gene flow mixture, probably pre-literate imperial polities, like the Uruk period, for example, in Mesopotamia,
Mhm.
expanded to Syria, Anatolia. And so I think there's a lot of stuff going on there that we don't know about because we don't have writing from there. But the genetics indicates like this great admixture. And that's what you see in a lot of populations over the last 20,000 years. There's a lot of admixture. Oh, so Sumerian DNA. I think
Before you go to the Sumerian DNA, so you would say basically that 80% of the people in the modern day Israel, based off what you have studied over the years, would reflect people who were actually there 4,000, 5,000, six
I said
thousand
Lebanon.
years, but
I
not
think
before that.
I said Lebanon. So Ashkenazi Jews are different because half of their ancestry is non-Middle Eastern,
Mhm.
right? The other half is Middle Eastern, and that is from that 80% works on. So that 80% applies to 50% of their ancestry. Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews are different themselves. Sephardic Jews from Morocco have some Berber ancestry, obviously. Mizrahi Jews from Iraq, Syria, they tend to be much more like the foundational Middle Eastern populations. They also found, European ancestry in the Philistines. That's one of the things that's referred to that article, I think. So, there's been like a great mixture that's happened, but it's on top of the Bronze Age period. And so obviously Ashkenazi Jews are somewhat separate because half their ancestry is Western European, Northern European, whatever, but the other half goes back to that period.
Hey,
Okay.
hey, Garfield, let me ask the doctor one more question, and I'm gonna leave. So, would it be safe to say for the audience that the Hebrews, or the people that we know as Yahuda Jews, are are a Bronze Age people, and they're not solely Natufians? Because some people like to
Yes.
equate the.
They're
Oh,
not-
yes.
You're exactly correct. The
Stay there, Gozi.
Natufians, I'd have to go and check, but I think like the Natufians are like by the Bronze Age, they're like half the ancestry or less, like around there. You know, they're around half.
Right. I was gonna ask. So the Natufians are there tens of thousands of years ago, and then the other lineages that come into the Middle East, they come in the middle with the Bronze Age. Is it a
Or earlier than the Bronze
or
Age.
earlier?
Yeah, let's say like it's not even Copper Age, but like Copper Age and earlier, like late Neolithic and Copper Age. So let's say like between 6,000 and 3,000 BC. I'll give you that time period.
So,
Okay,
the Natufians wouldn't be a good example to use to determine that these are Israelites or Jews, correct, Doc?
Yeah, no, because those groups came together later. So what are they a mix of? That 80% that I'm talking about is Natufian, Anatolian farmer, and Zagros farmer.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Zagros,
So-
yeah, from the mountains, right? Caucasus Mountains. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so,
So
they're like a
yeah.
melting pot of those two groups, and that's how you would, you know, people like who look like me didn't exist 6,000 years ago, so you can't say that ancient groups are Indian. Like Indians are from a mixture, right? So
right.
like 50,000 years ago, people that look like you didn't exist either. So, you know, we can say the same thing about the Israelites. Like there's a certain period where their genetic components did not coexist together, as you can't ask that question. I think maybe by 5,000 years ago, you can start asking the question. That's about when.
Right. So what would you say as far as haplogroups or genetics? Which would, I don't know if you answered before, like the founding haplogroups, would it be closer to a J or E1B1B lineage for Jews in the Levant? Because they come, they say Abraham might be placed in the Bronze Age and
So
whatever. What would be like?
The Cohens are, I think, a J1P53. But I think that the Afroasiatic languages are more with E. So I think the Cohens, people with the last name Cohen, that paternal lineage, I think that's intrusive to the Afroasiatic peoples. I think it came probably from Western Iran, maybe northern Mesopotamia. That's my opinion. I'm not 100% sure about that. But
okay, cool.
But in terms of haplogroups, yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. Ask. I was done.
All right. The question we're going to respond about the Sumerian DNA.
Yeah. So we don't have that because of political troubles in Iraq. I would anticipate that the Sumerian DNA is going to be enriched for. So if the people in the Levant are skewed to the Natufians, the Sumerian DNA is going to be skewed to the Zagros farmers, but they're going to be the same mix. Probably less Anatolian farmer because the Anatolian farmers seem to have like moved along the Mediterranean coast. I don't think they went as much that far south, but the Sumerians, like Mesopotamia, I think we're going to have the same because you see in Western Iran like Natufian type ancestry showing up. So they're obviously washing from the west to the east. They're going to go through Sumeria. So I think we will see. I'm not 100% sure about this. It would be cool if we saw something totally different because you guys know that it's an agglutinative language. It's a linguistic isolate. But it would be cool if they were special in some way, but they're probably going to turn out to be Zagros farmer plus Natufian, if I had to bet.
What about the Sephardic Jewish DNA as far as paternally? What are their markers? What are those people?
They're mostly Middle Eastern, mostly J and E, J1 and E, whatever, and also 10% are R1B, which means that those are probably male converts in Iberia.
Cool.
All right. I got another question here for you. Let me see. And Rasmois, thanks for the donation, by the way, beloved. Let me see, Dr. Khan. Let me see. Do some Qureshi and Sayedi and Pyrrhid families have Arab or Levantine DNA?
Yeah. Most of the ones in the Arab world seem real. They're a branch of J1, a brother lineage to the Cohen haplotype. Most of the ones in South Asia are fake, but some of them are not.
Okay. All right.
Maybe I shouldn't say fake, not valid.
Okay. All right. What about haplogroup R1B? I have this in my DNA. Is it African? Oh, he's probably talking about the same V88 you spoke about earlier.
If you're African American, it's probably European.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's probably
Um,
not. It's not probably V88.
okay.
For African Americans, it's mostly Western European, Northern Western European.
I'm Ashkenazi Jew. Are you saying we are not biblical Jewry? I don't think he said that, but you could respond, Dr. Khan.
Yeah, I didn't say that, but
Mhm. Let me ask you this. I was reading a study years ago. It said African Americans are mostly around 70% E1, B1A. African Americans. Would you say that? How long would you say, in your opinion, how long would these people have descended? They descended from lived actually in West Africa. How long were they in West Africa?
40,000 years. So
Okay.
I'm a believer in the. I might be wrong. I'm very unconfident, but I'm a believer in the old expansion of E within sub-Saharan Africa, not the
Okay.
new, not recent, right?
Okay. So what would the recent say? What have they said?
The research, it's just not clear. It's not clear.
Mm-hmm.
We
Okay.
don't have enough ancient DNA, and if you don't have ancient DNA, it's very unclear.
Okay. All right. I think Dr. Khan is being very careful, which a scholar should be, because you don't want to speak in absolutes. And I hope people understand that when people argue on YouTube, you can make all the absolute claims you want, but I guarantee you don't have PhD or doctor behind your name. Let me see if there's any more questions for Dr. Khan. Let me see. All right. So for now, what role would you say like a sickle cell would play? Because I was reading the research about a sickle cell, particular sickle cell that we have in African Americans and carriers of E1, B1A in West Africa, goes back to people 7,300 years ago in West Africa. I was reading the research about that sickle cell, that particular type of sickle cell trait that we carry. As a Jamaican, we carry 10% of us have that sickle cell trait. In Brazil, Afro-Brazilian, 10%. Same with African Americans. So what role would that play as far as proving how far back we go as far as where we descend from?
So sickle cell is an adaptation to malaria, and malaria really emerges with agriculture. So what happens is people cut down forests and they create standing water, like pools of standing water. And so the Anopheles, I think the Anopheles mosquito, carries malaria. It loves the standing water. And so the presence of sickle cell gene indicates your ancestors were agriculturalists. So it's not very common in pygmies, for example. Ancestral humans did not have it. Eventually, there's a variety of malaria adaptations all across the world. Sickle cell is just one of them, and we know it because of the health issues. But the issue is like it's not fundamentally African because it's just a mutation and it's an adaptation. There are people who are not African who have sickle cell. It's not as common, but it exists because malaria is really, really bad. We have like modern drugs like quinine and whatever to treat it, but before the modern era, it was really bad. It showed up in the Roman Empire in Rome, like the 3rd or 4th century AD. And it was one of the reasons that armies from Northern Europe did not like to occupy Rome very long because they would catch the Roman disease and die routinely. And so I think we underestimate how much of a force it was in shaping the genomes of humans. And it's kind of decoupled from ancestry. It's more about environment. It's like a genetic adaptation to respond to environment. Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. 93, do you have any more questions, my brother?
I don't know if I asked them already because I think there might be an article that you had talked about the population turnover of the Levant.
Yeah, I think I
think I asked you.
Yeah, that's on my blog. But so Yusuf Lazarides also has a paper, a preprint. It's by the Desduna sample. If you guys want to look at it, the DZU DNA, I think. If you want to Google that, there's a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff is going to come out in the next year or two. I think some of the questions that you asked that I was really vague on, I won't be vague within 5 years.
Okay. All right, no problem. And you said your marker is R. What's your marker? You said it earlier.
Oh, I'm R1AZ93, and on the female side, I'm U2B.
Okay.
So,
yeah. Oh, I got one last. If you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't want to keep Dr. Khan too long. Yeah.
So I'll answer this question, then I got a jet.
Go ahead, my brother. Yes.
Yeah. So the Batwa or pygmy group. That's what he's asking. Central African Congo and Khoisan. The two are very, very distinct. Khoisan seem to have separated from other modern human lineages like around 200,000 years ago. The pygmy groups separated closer to 150, 100. So these two are deep branches within Africa. And as a stylized fact, they're often clustered as hunter-gatherers as opposed to agriculturalists, the other branch of Africans, 99% of Africans. I think that that's a little too simplistic. There's a lot of deep structure within Africa that's been erased by the Bantu expansion and also in West Africa by farmers, right? So the relations are very distant between these two groups. The relation between me and a Chinese person is like, say, 30 to 40,000 years. Between a Bata and Khoisan, it's 150,000 years. Okay, so there you go, right? Just to give you a sense. Who has the older genes? All of our genes are the same age, right? I think what he's asking is who separated from the other human populations earliest to create the separate branch, and the Khoisan did. It looks like the Khoisan are the oldest extant, so they're still present as a continuous like biocultural group that separated earliest from the other branches of humans, but they're no older than we are, and we are no younger than they are. We all come from the same common ancestors 200 to 300,000 years ago. That answers your question.
Before you answer this last question, I have a question. I took like around 9 to 10 DNA tests, right? They pretty much say I'm E1B1A, all of them on the Y side, right? This is a rookie question. Now, can you tell from my DNA how old it is within my DNA exams or my tests? Is it possible?
You mean old in terms of how far it converges back?
As far as SNPs,
yes,
right?
Yes,
Okay.
you have to get like if you have a SNP array, which looks at a subset of genome, you can't always do that. But if you have a whole genome of the Y, you can do that. People do pay for that, and they can figure out like exactly where they are in the phylogeny and the fine genealogy. Because, like I said, I'm R1AZ93, so are 100 million men in the world.
Okay.
You need to look really deeply, and you can find exactly. So I'm actually like, I can nest myself within this group, within this county, in this part of the Indian subcontinent. People do that.
What's the name of the test that does that?
You can Google Big Y. Family Tree DNA has that. And then also there's some other companies, Full Genomes. Google Big Y or Full Genomes. Those two companies do whole genome Y chromosome analysis. I'll answer this last one. We're gonna go.
You know what? Don't answer that one. This one is the better question. Garfield, when looking at a DNA test, what number do we go off? The higher percentage or the lower to determine your ancestry? I guess he's talking autosomal.
I mean, if you're Sudanese Arab, and it comes back that you're more than 50% sub-Saharan African, are you gonna say you're not a Sudanese Arab? Most people will continue to, it's a cultural thing. So that's up to you as an individual to determine what you want to weight. So I didn't know that 15% of my ancestry was East Asian until I got genetically tested. Turns out all Bengalis are like this. That didn't really change my cultural or ethnic identity. And I think most people will not. Some people do. Google like cases where anti-Semitic people in Eastern Europe have found out that they're Jewish. That changes their identity a lot, but most cases it doesn't. It doesn't matter if you're 20% European, if you're African American versus 40%. The one case that I had that I've ever looked at, and I've looked at thousands at this point of African American DNA that had no, like, people whose ancestors were slaves in the United States, not like, people whose ancestors were immigrants from Ghana. There's one guy from Mississippi. He had no European ancestry. I didn't know what was going on. And then later he found out that his parents had adopted him from some African students who wanted their kids raised in the US and not told him. So that was the one individual who was African American who didn't have European ancestry. So
yeah, this question here, I don't want you to answer it. Dr. Khan already answered that his opinion that we go back probably E1B1A for like 40,000 years. The old model.
That's my opinion. I don't know if it's true.
But 4,000 years ago would be more realistic if you could probably say yes, 4,000 years ago.
For sure. Sure.
All right. Sure. Thanks a lot, Dr. Khan. I appreciate you taking the time. You're on Clubhouse. I did join your group, and I'm going to be following you because I'm like at 0% when it comes to knowledge of DNA, and you've definitely enlightened me.
Great talking to you.
All right. Thanks a lot, my
Very
brother.
nice meeting you, sir. Have a good day.
See you around.
And thanks again. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say, for those who want to borrow the video, be very careful. Be careful when you're clipping my video, and don't misuse it. Use, if you're gonna play the video, play the entire video, because I know how some people are. They will try to clip apart and say, "You see, we're Israelites. You see, we're not Israelites. You see, with this, we got to." And what this taught me, we got to stop talking with absolutes. Obviously, the question is, Jeremiah D. Yes, he does. He has a lot of peer review articles. A lot of this guy was an assistant for Spencer Wells for National Geographic. Go back and listen to the beginning. And I want to say to everybody, thanks for tuning in. I know there's people that's tuning in just to try to get their arguments right. My whole thing is West Africans, we have E1B1A. And E1B1A, according to him, he said he's not holding to it 100%, of course. But he said go back 40,000 years. This is way before there was an Africa. This is way before anybody was calling anywhere Egypt or Mesopotamia or Mizraim. It's way before that. I think one of the connections that we have to make when we talk about DNA is that before any of these things that we know today, we were, as a human being, we were before all of this. What did we do before that time? I think that's what we lose in a lot of these debates that we have. All right. But peace and love to y'all, family. I love y'all for coming out, man. And Jeremiah D, peace and love to you, bro. I see you in a minute. And I know this is a weird time to go live, but I mean, today's what? Today, I don't want to announce who I have. I don't want to announce who I have, but this week we do have scholars. We do have some scholars coming on. I do have couple of brothers on Thursdays, 2 shows on Thursdays. Tomorrow, Wednesday. Do I have a show tomorrow? Let me just double check just to make sure. Ladies and gentlemen,
most scholars, baby. That's what we need.
Yeah, I got a lot of scholars coming up for the rest of the months. Coming up. I'm not even. It's just that I do too much, and that's the problem. So tomorrow, I don't have anybody tomorrow, but on Thursday I have a scholar, a PhD, African American scholar who wrote about Judaism with black folks and converts and all that stuff. It's probably the best book I think every black person should read as far as Judaism, as far as being converted to Judaism, the Luso-Africans, the Sephardic, the traders, how we got to follow Judaism, and we need to get into that. The next person also is going to talk about black cults in the name of religion and how dangerous they can be. A brother that was in a cult that testified in front of the FBI and got his brother who was a part of a major organization locked up. I'm not going to announce anybody's name. Y'all going to tune in. I got Dr. Richard Carrier Friday. I ain't worried about announcing him. I got a couple of scholars coming up. I got Francesca Shavarolu. Well, I don't know how to pronounce her name. Forgive me for butchering the name. But she's coming up in March. I got a professor from Penn State University, another black brother from Senegal coming on to talk about Islam and what they did when they came over here, the slaves. He's an expert on that. These are PhDs. So we need to recognize the scholarship that I'm bringing and why I'm bringing them so that we could be better at understanding how scholars think. All right? All right. So Thursday, 3 o'clock and 8 o'clock. 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. I'm having 2 scholars on Thursday. I know these are weird times. I'm probably going to do a blast I'll probably do a blast in the morning or tonight so that people could catch the show who missed it and we're going to get some viewership up. All right? Peace and love, family. This is your brother Garfield. I'm out. Good to see my brother Tehoud in Mayat. I didn't see him in a minute. Good to see Miss Tiffany in the building. Good to see, of course, Mika, one of the generals in the building. And Dynamis, thank you for the donation. Peace and love. Please, you know what? Thanks for the donation. But I know when people say they donate money to Garfield, oh man, they're gonna hate you, Dynamis. They're gonna hate you, boy. You
give that crisp 10, baby. That's a Subway sandwich.
That agnostic. All right. So peace and love, family. I love y'all, man. I don't know. Should we go live after this and do a after show?
You can upload my video again because I'm missing 3 minutes.
I gotta delete that video right now. But peace and love, family. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you.
Alrighty.